Macroeconomics is a system that studies the economy at the level of an entire country or the world as a whole. It analyzes production, income, prices, employment, government finances, international trade, and the financial system. But the modern economy is extremely complex. Every day, billions of transactions take place within it. International shipments, lending, investments, the production of goods, changes in exchange rates, and shifts in interest rates. That is why economists use a system of macroeconomic indicators. Macroeconomic indicators are statistical data that help evaluate the condition of an economy, its dynamics, and its structure. In this lesson, we will break down macroeconomic indicators in a systematic way. We will divide them into major groups: production, prices, the labor market, money and finance, government finances, the international economy, and the well-being of the population. We will also see how these indicators are connected to one another. Let's begin. The first thing macroeconomics measures is production. In other words, how many goods and services does a country's economy create? The main indicator here is GDP. GDP shows the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a certain period of time, most commonly 1 year. The key word here is final. For example, if a company produces steel and then a car manufacturer uses that steel to build a car, GDP only includes the value of the finished car. This is done to avoid double counting. GDP includes goods, services, government spending, investments, exports. But it does not include the sale of used goods, the informal economy, unpaid household labor. GDP is most commonly calculated using the following formula. This formula shows that an economy is made up of different types of spending. Consumption is usually the largest part of the economy. When people actively spend money, companies earn more revenue, increase production, hire workers, and invest in growth. That is why consumer behavior has a major impact on economic growth. However, GDP has one important problem. It can grow even when the real volume of production barely changes. The reason is inflation. If prices rise, the total value of goods and services also increases. That is why economists distinguish between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is measured using current prices. So if prices increase, nominal GDP will also rise. Real GDP is adjusted for inflation. It shows whether the economy is actually producing more goods and services. For example, if nominal GDP grows by 12%, but prices increase by 9% during the same period, then real economic growth is approximately 3%. Real GDP is the measure economists use to analyze long-term economic growth. Another important indicator is GDP per capita. It shows how much economic output, on average, is generated per person. This indicator is often used as an approximate measure of living standards, because a large economy does not always mean a high level of prosperity. For example, a country may have an enormous total GDP because it has a very large population. But if that GDP is divided among millions of people, the average income level may still be relatively low. That is why GDP per capita often gives a better picture of the difference between rich and poor countries. However, even this indicator is not perfect. It shows an average value, and averages do not reflect inequality. For example, if a small group of people controls a huge share of total income, the average figure may look high even though most of the population is not wealthy. Because of this, economists have long criticized GDP as a universal measure of well-being. GDP is very good at measuring production, but it is much worse at measuring quality of life. For example, GDP does not show the level of inequality, environmental problems, the quality of education, stress levels, access to healthcare, the amount of free time, or public safety. In addition, many valuable activities are not included in GDP at all. For example, household work, childcare, volunteering. Another issue is the shadow economy. In many countries, part of the business sector operates unofficially. These incomes often do not appear in official statistics. That is why economists created additional indicators such as HDI, the Human Development Index, the Happiness Index, and various quality of life indicators. That is why modern economics analyzes not just one number, but an entire system of indicators. The second major group of indicators is prices. Because it is not enough to know how much the economy produces, we also need to understand what is happening to the value of money. And this is where inflation comes in. Inflation is the general increase in the price level within an economy. When inflation is high, money gradually loses its purchasing power. In other words, the same amount of money can buy fewer goods and services. Inflation is most commonly measured using the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. To calculate it, economists create what is called a consumer basket. It includes food, housing, transportation, electricity, healthcare, clothing, services. Statistical agencies then track how the cost of this basket changes over time. If the average price level rises by 5%, that means inflation is approximately 5%. Why does inflation affect the entire economy? Inflation affects almost every economic decision. For example, if people expect high inflation, they may start spending money more quickly. In this situation, businesses raise prices, adjust wages, and change their investment plans. Banks also react to inflation. When inflation becomes too high, central banks often raise interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive. People spend less. Companies borrow less money. Economic activity slows down. In this way, central banks try to reduce the pace of price growth. The next major area is the labor market. Here, the main macroeconomic indicator is the unemployment rate. It shows the percentage of people who want to work but do not have a job. If a person stops looking for work, is studying, does not want to work, or has retired, they may not be included in the statistics. That is why the real situation in the labor market can be more complex. There are different types of unemployment: frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, cyclical unemployment, seasonal unemployment. For example, during a recession, companies lay off workers. This is cyclical unemployment. But when technology replaces certain professions, that is structural unemployment. Unemployment is extremely important because work is not just about earning a salary. It is also connected to stability, consumption, taxes, psychological well-being, and social stability. High unemployment often leads to political instability, poverty, crime, and social radicalization. However, even in a strong economy, unemployment is almost never equal to zero. Why? Because people constantly change jobs, move to new places, search for better opportunities, graduate from university, or start businesses. Some level of unemployment exists naturally. Economists call this the natural rate of unemployment. Now let's move on to money. The modern economy operates through the financial system, and macroeconomics constantly measures the money supply, interest rates, credit activity, banking activity, and financial markets. One of the key concepts here is the money supply. Economists divide it into different categories: M0, M1, M2, M3, M4. In macroeconomics, the main goal is to understand the liquidity of money, meaning how quickly money can be spent and how cash-like it is. That is why the classification moves from the most liquid forms of money to the less liquid ones: M0, M1, M2, M3, M4. M0 consists of base money, cash in circulation, and central bank money. This is the simplest form of money. M1 includes M0, cash, and plus funds in checking accounts. These are funds that can be used almost instantly for payments. M2 includes M1, time deposits, and savings that can be quickly converted into money. This is a broader concept that better reflects the real liquidity of the economy. M2 is most commonly used in macroeconomic analysis because it is strongly connected to consumption, credit, and inflationary pressure. M3 is an even broader money supply measure. It includes M2, large time deposits, institutional money funds, and other large liquid financial assets. At this level,
we are no longer talking only about money for spending, but also about a large share of the economy's financial savings. M4 is an even broader concept and is not used consistently across all countries. It may include M3, long-term deposits, and additional financial instruments that can be converted into money, but not quickly. So M4 represents the widest measure of liquid financial assets. The more liquid money exists in the system, the easier it is to take loans, invest, finance business activity, and support economic growth. Another very important concept is the interest rate. The interest rate is the price of money. When rates are low, loans are cheaper. People and businesses borrow and spend more. When rates are high, borrowing becomes more expensive. Economic activity often slows down. Through interest rates, central banks influence inflation, consumption, investment, and the pace of economic growth.
Financial markets are also an important source of information. For example, stock indices, bond yields, and exchange rates. They constantly reflect investors' expectations about the future of the economy. Let's move on to the next block. No modern economy exists without the state. That is why macroeconomics separately analyzes government finances. This includes taxes, government spending, the budget, and public debt. The main indicator here is the budget balance. If a government spends more than it receives, a budget deficit occurs. If it receives more than it spends, there is a budget surplus. Economists also analyze public debt. When a government spends more than it collects through taxes, a deficit is created. To cover it, the government borrows money. This is how public debt accumulates. Debt itself is not always a problem. Many developed countries have very large levels of debt. The real questions are, can the country service its debt? Do investors trust it? What currency the debt is denominated in? What the structure of the economy is? And what the interest rate on the debt is. Problems begin when debt becomes uncontrollable. Then a country may face a loss of investor confidence, currency devaluation, inflation, default, and a financial crisis. Government spending is also extremely important. It affects education, infrastructure, healthcare, defense, social programs, and scientific research. In other words, the public sector is not just budget spending. It is one of the key components of a modern economy. The next block is international economics. No large economy today exists in isolation. Countries constantly trade, invest, borrow, buy and sell currencies, and build global production chains. That is why macroeconomics measures international economic relationships. One of the main indicators here is the trade balance. If a country exports more than it imports, a trade surplus occurs. If imports exceed exports, there is a trade deficit. Another important concept is the balance of payments. It shows all financial flows between a country and the rest of the world. The exchange rate also plays a key role. It affects import prices, export competitiveness, international investment, inflation. In the global economy, even the decisions of a central bank in one major country can influence almost the entire world. And now we come to the broadest group of indicators, population well-being. Because the economy does not exist only to produce goods, the main question is, how do people actually live? That is why economists analyze income levels, poverty, inequality, access to education, life expectancy, quality of healthcare, and housing conditions. One of the most well-known indicators is HDI, the Human Development Index. It combines income, education, and life expectancy. In other words, it tries to measure human development more broadly than GDP alone. Economists also use poverty rates, the Gini coefficient, real wages, and labor productivity. Because an economy can be growing, but if most people do not feel an improvement in their lives, that is not enough to fully understand the situation. Now we come to one of the most important parts of the lesson, the limitations of macroeconomic indicators. Numbers can be misleading. Sometimes an economy looks great on paper, but society feels like it is in crisis. Why does this happen? Because statistics have limitations, data can be delayed, indicators do not capture the full reality, governments can sometimes manipulate numbers, different methodologies produce different results. For example, GDP can be growing while household incomes are falling. The stock market can be breaking records while the middle class is shrinking. Unemployment can be low while wages remain stagnant. That is why professional economists never look at just one indicator. They analyze the system, context, structure, and trends. Many people think macroeconomics is something distant for governments, bankers, or professors. But in reality, macroeconomics affects your daily life. It determines whether inflation will erode your income, whether it will be easy to find a job, whether housing prices will rise, whether markets will fall, whether loans will be cheap, whether wages will grow, and whether a crisis will happen. When you understand macroeconomic indicators, you begin to understand the world better, and you stop reacting to news purely emotionally. You start to see structure, causes, systems. Conclusion. Macroeconomic indicators are the language of the modern economy. They help us understand what is happening, why it is happening, and where the economy is going. But the most important thing is not just looking at numbers, it is understanding what they actually mean. Because the real economy is not just tables and charts, it is people, their work, their income, their fears, their decisions, and their future. And macroeconomic indicators help us see this enormous system as a whole. In the next lessons, we will go even deeper into key economic indicators: employment, unemployment, and productivity. So subscribe to the channel and remember, economics is not just about money. It is about how the modern world works. Thank you for watching and see you in the next lesson.